Hi, I'm Chris from Chris Lucas Designs. In this video sew along, we're going to be making the sleeveless dress from my Fit and Flair pattern collection. If you haven't already got your pattern, you'll find a link to the pattern in the description box below, where you can get your pattern and start sewing along with me. Now, before we begin, what you need to do, cut out all your pattern pieces. Use those pattern pieces to cut out your fabric. In the pattern itself, you'll find there's a cutting layout and also how to interface the yoke and the waistband. It's really important that you do interface those pieces because they do help stabilise that neckline and give it a little bit more structure and stability there. So also in the description box below, I've put some timestamp links. So if you only want to watch how to do, say for example, the yoke section of the bodice and how to gather it and how to get it to sit really well, you can skip ahead and just watch that one little section of the video. Or if you're new to sewing, I recommend you watch the video and you can sew along with me right from the beginning through to the end, because I do share lots of little tips, especially if you're new to sewing, and even more so if you're new to sewing dolls' clothes. So once you've got all your fabric cut out and you're all ready to go, let's get started. What we need to make sure we do is on our front bodice piece, we want to mark the little notch here where the gathering stitches are going to begin. So to do that, you just make a little tiny little snip in your fabric. There, I've got a little snip there, so it's just an easy reference guide there for me. So with your centre front, this is your neckline edge. I've made a little note on the pattern so that you don't get these mixed up, which I'll explain in a minute a little bit further. And this is your waistline edge, the shorter edge here. So you cut that pattern piece on the fold, and what I've done then is I've marked just little notches at the center front, at the neckline edge and at the waistline edge, because that'll make it easier to line things up when we join the other pattern pieces together. So once we've done that, open up your bodice piece. Now I wanted to show you, and just to make sure that we get this up the right way, the long edge here, this is actually your neckline edge. This little short edge here, this is your waistline edge. What we're going to be doing is gathering up this little neckline edge, and that will attach to the front yoke. So it is quite easy to get these pieces mixed up and to think that this is the actual neckline and this is the waist, but don't make that mistake. Make sure your pattern piece is laying this way. The diagrams in the pattern will show you this way as well, the photographs. So this is the area we're going to work on first, and we're going to do our gathering stitches. So to do that, to make it a little easier so you can see, and it also makes it a little easier for me to find where this little notch is that I marked where my gathering stitches are going to start and stop, I'm just going to pop a little pin in there. That way then it'll be easy for me to find, and I'm also going to pop a pin at the end because that's where my gathering stitches will stop. I'll set my stitch length to about a 3.5. I find that gives me a really nice little gather, so the little gathers aren't too far apart. So there, so I've got nice long threads tail, so I'll be able to use those threads to pull up my gathers. I'm going to do my 2 rows of gathering stitches starting where that pin is. Now I'm just going to drop that needle down, and I'll take that pin out because now I know exactly where I'm starting. My first row of stitches, I'm going to do approximately a little bit over an eighth of an inch from this raw edge, and then when we do the second row of stitches, we'll do about a 1/4 of an inch away from this first row. We'll stop here where that pin is, lift up my needle, leave some nice long thread tails again. And I'm going to do my second row of gathering stitches. So roughly around about a 1/4 of an inch from where you started that first row, and we'll do our second row of gathering stitches. I've got my centre notch marked here, and what I'll do is, to make it easier to find as well, I'm just going to place a little pin at that centre mark. And then from the reverse side, I'm going to pull up my bobbin threads, and I'm going to pull up the gathers at that neckline, sorry. Get myself confused there, getting a bit tongue-tied. And I'll just pull that in so it's nice and taut. So you can see there, got some nice neat little gathers. I just find the stitch length of 3.5 on a quilting cotton produces a really nice neat little gather. So separating those threads again, I'm going to pull up my bobbin threads. I try to be consistent when I'm pulling different threads for gathering, because if I pull the opposite thread, I'll actually lock the stitches in place, which we don't want to do. Got my bobbin threads there. I'm just going to gather that fabric in to the centre again. Bringing them right into the middle. And there we go. So that's our little neckline edge of the front bodice piece, all ready for the yoke to be attached. So I've got my front yoke pattern piece. We've got the centre front here. What I'm going to do with that one as well is I'm just going to mark that centre front also so that I know where to line it up. Just a tiny little snip. There we go. I open this up to the right side of the fabric. This pattern piece is interfaced. Please definitely interface it. Just a lightweight woven fusible interfacing works perfect for it. So you can see there I've got my little notch at the centre front. Now if we lay this front yoke piece up the right way, got our bodice front up the right way, what we're going to do now is with this up the right way, it's got a little smiley face, is we're going to turn it over so we've got a little upside down smile. And then we're going to line up the centre front with the little pin that we popped in. Place a pin in there. This little seam here is actually our shoulder seam, so what we need to do is bring it up to match the shoulder seam on the bodice. To do that, just grab this corner, match up those two corners there, line up those shoulder seams, line up that raw neck edge. Okay, that's pretty good, and we'll place a pin. So that will secure those in place. We're going to repeat the same for the other shoulders. This corner here, we're going to bring this up and match up with the shoulder seam on the bodice. Line up those edges, line up this edge, and we'll place a pin. Okay, so this is what we're looking like from the right side of the bodice. This is the wrong side of the yoke, and then from this side. Now what I'm going to do is I need to spread these gathers out here and this fabric to line up and match the yoke. So I'm just going to release some of those nice tight gathers that I put in, and you can see how beautifully they sit. Because we did not too big a gathering stitch length, gives us a really pretty little gather. So once we've got it so that those fabrics are the equal distance apart, I'm going to come over here to where that little notch was, where I started and stopped my gathering stitches. I'm going to pop a little pin in there at that notch, and those little gathering threads, let's take that out there, twisted around the threads. So that was the bobbin threads I pulled up. I'm just going to lock those threads in a figure 8 around that pin, and that will stop those threads from going any further and becoming too big in this gathering area. So now I'm just going to fan out those little gathers till I think they look pretty. It doesn't have to be perfect because you can adjust the little gathers as we're sewing it as well. But you can see there everything lines up flat. There's no excess fabric on either one. We'll just slide this up, lining up the top raw edges there, and I'll place in a pin. And I'm going to do the same for this side of the front bodice. Spread out my little gathers so they sit pretty. Okay. line up well. You can see I've got a little bit of excess fabric here, so I'm just going to pull those little gathering threads up a little bit, bring that in, and it looks like I'm pretty good. I'll place a pin, and I'm going to do a figure 8 with those threads to lock those threads in place. And now I'll come back and I'll manipulate these gathers a little bit more just to get them nice and even. Sometimes I find if I pinch the little gathers with my fingers and just give that fabric a little tug, you can get those gathers to sit a little bit flatter. Line up the raw edges of the fabric so they're sitting pretty good there, and I'll place a pin. Now before we sew our seam, I'm just going to go back and check that everything's fitting in there nicely. Pretty happy with that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're going to sew along this edge here. As we're sewing along, we'll try to maintain as evenly as we can these raw edges together at the top. Secure my stitches. Now as I'm going along, you can use a pin, or you could use, like I've got a little awl here, and I can sort of help thread the fabric through and adjust my gathers as I'm going. The main thing is we're sewing between those 2 rows of gathering stitches. I'm using this little part here on my presser foot as my guide for my 1/4 inch seam allowance, because on my machine, from this needle here to this little mark here on my pressing foot is a good 1/4 inch for me. Just pull out some of those excess threads I had wrapped around in that figure 8 around that needle. And I'll secure the stitches at the end here. Now, so this is from the bodice, wrong side of the bodice and the wrong side of the yoke. You can see my stitches through here. A little bit off there, but it's pretty good. Now, what we need to do is we're going to be flipping this yoke up the right way like this. And you'll notice when we have a look from the back, there's quite a bit of excess fabric there. So what we're going to do is we're going to snip some little V's, snip some notches out of there and remove some of this excess fabric. So I'll just go around stitching up to, but not through, that row of stitching we did. It's easier to do it from your yoke side because you can see that stitching line. So I'm just going to go through and just take out some little V's and remove that excess fabric. And if you do happen to accidentally snip through this row of stitching, what you can do is just go back and do a few more stitches, even if you have to come in it a little bit, and it should still be fine. You'll notice this time when we press up that seam allowance up towards the neckline edge of the yoke, we've eliminated all of that excess fabric, and this will now sit nice and flat. So from the right side, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to finger press that seam allowance up towards this way so I get a nice neat little edge around our yoke. There we go. I'll show you a look. So that's sitting nice and flat there. And we've got, now I'm going to go to the pressing station, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to press so that that seam allowance is facing up, and I'll just use the tip of my iron and I'll come in and just gently press through this way because I don't want to flatten those nice little gathers there. So I'll be back in a minute. Okay, back again. So you can see that's sitting nice and flat there. Now what I'm going to do is that second row of gathering stitches that's visible on the bodice, I'm just going to remove that row there. There's no need to remove the first row of gathering stitches we did because that's inside the seam allowance. Just going to pull up that thread So again, pulling on that bobbin thread tail, and you can see I can just easily pull out that thread. Comes out nice and smooth. From the right side of the fabric now, I can just pull up that thread that we had here and pull that out as well. So here we've got our back bodice, and here we've got our back yoke. The important thing to note on your back yoke is I've got at the center back seam, I've got 2 little notches. What I've done is I've snipped just about 1/8 of an inch long there, 2 little notches there, so that I don't get confused as to which is the center back and which is the shoulder seam of the yoke. So really important, make sure you make a mark where the center back is. Even if you wanted to do that with a little fabric marker, you could just use a little vanishing pen and just place a couple little marks where those are, and you'll always remember then that that's your center back. Okay. So this is our 2 back bodice pieces. So we'll turn those so that they're facing the right way out. These are our 2 back yoke pieces. They're the center backs. So this one will go here. That's my center back. I've got my little notches there. So that's a center back as well. And we'll be attaching these yokes to these corresponding bodices. Now what we need to do here is we're going to turn these so that these are right sides together. So flip our back yoke over the back bodice so that the center backs are facing. We'll line these up so that the top edges are lined up and the center back seam. Place a pin. Now we need to line up this shoulder seam with this shoulder seam. So we'll grab this little corner and we'll flip it around and we'll line those up so that the shoulder seams, raw edges at the shoulder seams are lined up, and this little edge here is lined up. And then we'll place a pin. Now here you'll see we've got to try and get a concave and a convex curves lining up. Your concave, always easy to remember, is the one that's going in like a cave, and your convex curve is the one that's coming out. So to make this easier, what you can do is you can actually do a few little snips along that concave edge, which in this case is your back bodice. And I'm doing little snips about roughly 1/4 inch apart, and I'm snipping in about 1/8 of an inch. And what that's going to do is that's going to release that fabric. You can already see how much more relaxed it is, so that it'll make it easier to line up these raw edges together. And you'll see from this side how they're just, the little snips are just fanning out a little bit. So we can move that up, line up those raw edges. This is probably the fiddliest part in the pattern. So those little edges there are lined up. Place a pin. And as we're sewing, we can just keep ensuring that these little edges are lined up. Now I'm going to, on this one, I'm starting at the centre back. I've got my back 1/4 inch seam allowance. Drop my needle down. And I'm just going to use an awl, or I'll show you as well how you could use a pin just to manipulate and manoeuvre that fabric. So I want these raw edges lined up. So my pin has helped me move that over. So I'll do my couple of locking stitches. And I'm just going to use that pin to manipulate this fabric. And continue sewing around. Now as you're sewing around, you're going to find you've got some excess fabric here. When you get to the stage where it looks like you may be starting to make a little pleat, when I get to there I'll show you what I'm going to do. So I'm coming up, there could be a little pleat there, so what I'm going to do is I can lift up my presser foot, just move that fabric towards the back, making sure I keep those raw edges lined up, and I'll just continue on. Here it looks like I'm going to make another little pleat here, So I'll just get a little bit closer, lift up my presser foot and just pull that fabric towards the back. And that sort of will eliminate any little pleats getting sewn in. Just keeping my raw edges even. And I'll continue on doing that 1/4 inch seam allowance. We'll back stitch at the end of the seam. Now we can have a look. So this was the little seam that we did, and that's it from the wrong side of the yoke. Now, so we will be doing the same thing again and pressing that yoke up and the seam allowance up. So seam allowance up towards the yoke, just giving it a finger press along that seam. Now you'll notice again, we've got excess fabric. You can see it sort of buckling up. So we're going to do the same thing again, and we're going to take out a couple of little notches. You can actually sort of quite easily see where the excess fabric is, so you can just notch in those areas because this part here is fairly straight. But I'll come one more. So sewing, clipping up close to but not through that seam allowance. I know I need to take out this piece here because that had quite a bit of excess there. And I'll do one more here because that had a little pucker, little bubbly bit there where it was coming up. And I'll just check that. Press that seam allowance up, and now you can see it will sit nice and flat in there. So just give that another little finger press along that seam. Sitting really nicely. Now before I go to the pressing station and press that in place, I'll repeat the same steps that we just did on the other back bodice. There we go. There's our 2 back bodice pieces. So what we're going to do now is we're going to get our front bodice piece back again. So here's our cute little front bodice, and we're going to attach those to the shoulder seams of the back bodice. So place this one right side down, line up our shoulder seams there, and I'll line up these seams here as best as I can. Okay. Having the seam allowances up towards, oh sorry, I'm out of view there. Seam allowance up towards the yoke. There. Now, I need to try and line up because our seam allowance is at the 1/4 inch mark. So I want to try and line up these seams here where they intersect at that 1/4 inch mark. So I've got those lined up, and I'm going to place a pin in there. It's lined up with the stitching line on this side as well, and from this side, and I'll pin that in place. These edges here, as I'm sewing, I can manipulate those over. I'll show you can just place a pin there as well. Line up these raw edges there and place a pin. So that's that shoulder seam. Now what I like to do as well when I'm sewing this seam is I'm going to start from the bodice edge and sew towards the centre, and even the same on this edge, because it'll just help make sure that I get these seams here to line up as best I can. So when I sew this one, I'll flip it over and I'll come from this way. We can start on this one now while we're here. So underneath my seam, my presser foot, 1/4 inch seam allowance again. Lock those stitches in place. Now, because I had that little pucker in that seam, I'm just going to use that pin to make sure that they stay nice and flat. Coming up to that seam, remove that pin, and I'll lock my stitches at the end. Now let's have a look and see how we went. So there's our little seam there. If I turn this to the right side, and our little seams here have intersected quite well. I just find that that little tip definitely does help a little bit. If you did find at any time that this little seam's a little bit where I've gone there and I was manipulating it. Just check and see how it sits from the right side. That's still sitting beautiful, so I'll just leave that as it is. Always remember, there's a little bit of forgiveness in your sewing, so not everything has to be absolutely perfect. Okay, inside here. So we're going to open up these shoulder seams and we're going to press those open because then they'll lay nice and flat when we join the bodice together. So you can use your fingernail or anything there just to open up that seam allowance and just give that a little finger press. Manipulate that seam down so it stays nice and flat. We'll go to the iron and we'll give that a press as well. I just find opening them up with your fingers at first is a real big help. Okay, open that little intersecting seam, give it a little squish, and then our shoulder seam there. Now I'll go to the pressing station and I'll give that a little press. In this section of the video, we're going to be sewing our bodice lining. So you'll need your lining bodice front piece, which is cut on the fold. And what I recommend there that we do is we make a little mark at the center front there at the neckline, and we'll also do one at the waist there as well. To do that, we'll just make a little snip at the center there, just a tiny little snip. That's all we need, and we'll do one at the bottom there as well. Just makes it easier to find the centers later. So that's our center front, and there's our little notch there at the neck edge, and again there at the waist. Now, so this is our lining bodice back pieces. Getting tongue-tied again there. Okay, so we've got those and we are good to go. All we need to do with this one, with right sides facing up, if your fabric is the same either way, I know this one was the same direction because that's my little fold there from the center front. And what we're going to do is with our back pieces, I have cut them right sides together. I'm going to place one here and one here. We'll be sewing our shoulder seams. So first off, I'll line up the top edge of this shoulder, lining up the raw edges at either side, and I can place a pin. The beginning, the end. It's not even necessary really to place a pin, but if you're fairly new to sewing and you don't want things to move around, it's a good idea to place your pins. And then we'll attach the other back bodice, lining up the shoulder seams there again, and we'll place a pin. I'll do one at each end of the seams. Just making sure all our raw edges are even. And we'll sew the shoulder seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Locking our stitches again at the beginning and at the end of each seam. You could be using a coordinating thread. I'm just continuing on with the same thread that I had. Lock the stitches at the end and then do the other shoulder seam. Lock those stitches at the beginning and at the end. What we'll do now is we're going to press those shoulder seams open. You can trim any excess threads that you've got there. It's always a good idea to keep your work tidy as you're going. So that's from the right side. Turn it over to the wrong side. And I'm going to use my awl to help me spread those seam allowances apart. And then I'll just give them a little finger press just to make sure they're sitting nice and flat. And I'll do the other shoulder seam as well. Nice and flat there. and I'll take that to the pressing station and give that a press. So there's our seam allowances. They're pressed open and flat there now. The next step that we need to do is we're going to get our bodice front. So that was our front. We'll lay that right side up there. And we're going to lay our bodice lining wrong sides facing up. And then we'll lay those on top of each other so that our bodice and lining are right sides facing each other. And what we're going to do next is we're going to pin and sew our neckline edge here. So I'll just get our raw edges of the centre back there, neck edges, raw edges here and raw edges there, and I'll place a pin. Now we're going to line up our shoulder seams. So there's our little seams there. Line those up and we'll place a pin. Now we're going to match up our centre fronts. Because we've got those little notches there, that makes it nice and easy to line those up. And we'll place a pin. Come around to this shoulder seam. We'll line up these these seams here again, the shoulder seams, line those up, and then match our raw edges here. Place a pin, and then we've got our next centre, our second centre back seam there. Line up those raw edges at the top and at the centre back, and we'll place a pin. And now we're just going to go around and sew around that neckline, and we'll use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. As I come up to this shoulder seam, I'm just going to make sure that my seam allowance hasn't flipped on me. And I'll just continue going around that curve, trying to maintain a fairly consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just checking that these raw edges are lined up. They're lined up pretty good. Shoulder seam again there, just going to make sure that that seam allowance hasn't flipped on me. Nothing's sitting in underneath there. Again, they're trying to maintain a fairly consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance. And lock the stitches there at the end. Cut my threads. And let's have a look. So there's our 1/4 inch seam allowance sewn there. And then from the right side, or from the bodice side there. This is an optional step, but what I want to do is I want to understitch this neckline edge. And what that entails is pressing this seam allowance, making sure that it's facing towards the lining. Give that a little finger press through there. There's our shoulder seam. Just manipulating that seam allowance up towards the lining. So from the back side, just making sure that this seam allowance is facing the lining. Okay, so to understitch this one, seam allowance up towards the lining, and I'm going to sew around about 1/8 of an inch from this neckline edge. You can do I would recommend doing a coordinating thread, but for the purpose of the video here, I'm just using the existing thread that I've got, and it will actually make it easier for you to see the sewing that I'm doing. No need to lock your stitches at the beginning and end. Oh, got a little bit stuck there, just manipulate that through. And I'm just pulling apart this seam, sewing that seam allowance down flat on the lining edge. Just always check underneath that your seam allowance is going the right way. You can generally feel it underneath here as well. Just manipulating around that neckline. Manipulating that fabric so that I don't get any little puckers. Try to maintain that consistent sort of seam allowance there. I've got it roughly around about 1/8 of an inch. Okay, no need to lock at the end there. So here I'll just hold this up so you can sort of see. So this is the row of stitching that I've done around this edge, and it's on the lining side. Now the benefit of this is, now when we flip this bodice over to the right side and then we push our lining towards the back side, this will fold naturally quite easily around that neckline edge and sit nice and flat. So I'm just giving it a little finger press as I'm going around. See there? It just makes it so easy. Gives a nice little edge finish. Nice crisp edge. Pressing those down. Bring that little back out. Pressing that down. Bring this centre back out so that this sits nice and flat here. There we go, and pressing that down. Now from the wrong side, this is what we're seeing from the lining side now. So you can see we've got a nice crisp little fold. Everything's coming over to the lining side. So you're not going to see that seam from the right side. I'm just going through and I'm just double checking that everything's sitting over there nice. Giving it a little bit more of a finger press. There we go. So I can lay that down there. See, it's all sitting nice and flat. Now I'm going to go over to the pressing station and I'm actually going to give this a little press with my iron to get that so that it sits nice and flat for us even better. And we're back again. So there's my neck edge, it's pressed nice and flat there. Next what we're going to do is just going to actually flip this back so that these are right sides together, because we're going to sew the armholes. Now, so if we get with right sides of our fabric together, bring over that shoulder seam, match the shoulder seams there, and then we'll pin that shoulder seam in place. This is going to encase the armholes. And then we're going to come down here, line up these two side seam edges there. Just turn this around, make it easier. Line up the side seam edge and the top of the seam here, top of the edges there. Place a pin, and then I'm just going to also place a pin here in the middle of the arm's eye there. Come around the other side of the armhole. We'll line up those side seam edges and that top edge, and place a pin. Okay, and they're in the middle of the arm side there. I'm going to place another pin. Okay, so they've lined up perfectly. Okay, from our bodice side and from our lining side. So what we're going to do now is we're going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the armholes here. I'll lock my stitches at the beginning and at the end of the seam, and try to maintain a fairly even 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to check that my seams here underneath haven't flipped over my seam allowance. Oh, that's sitting right. So I get close to my pin, take my pin out, and just continue sewing around the armhole. And I'll lock my stitches again at the end of the seam. Snip my threads from the wrong side. You can see the seam allowance there. Looks like I may have got a little pucker. I think it's come out with a little bit of a finger press there. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to clip some notches around these armholes here, just so the armholes will sit nice and flat when we turn them the right way out. So around about every 1/4 inch, just make some clips up to, but not through, that stitching line. You can remove a little bit of bulk here at this shoulder seam. Just an optional thing you can do. You can do that on the back here as well. And continue making those clips around that armhole. That'll get our curves to sit nice and flat. From the bodice front, what we're going to do is we're going to pull through the bodice back through the shoulder seam. So what I like to use is a little loop turner. It's got a little hook on the end there, and I can thread that up through, and I can grab hold of my lining fabric. I usually do grab a hold of the lining, because if it does put a little tiny hole in there, it's on the lining side. And if you do it where the seam allowance is, the little tiny hole will be inside the seam allowance. So there we go, that's pulled through, sitting nice and flat. And because we did that little bit of top stitching or understitching there, our shoulder seams are sitting nice and flat there for us as well. Now with the other side, so going through the front of the bodice, if you don't happen to have a loop turner, you can also use a safety pin. I'll show you that as well, because not everybody has a loop turner in their little bag of sewing tools. So I'm just going to attach a pin to the bottom edge of that lining. I'm going to come up through that shoulder seam from the back. I'm just going to pass that pin through the shoulder seam, and then I can see it from this side here, and then I can just grab that pin. And there I can see my lining fabric. I can take the pin out. It's done its job. And then I can just pull that fabric through. There we go. Easy. Oh, it's starting to look so cute. I love it when we get to this stage. So there's our shoulders. There's our armholes there. So they're sitting nice. You can just give that a little finger press there. Okay. They're sitting really well. Just give that a little press there. Just a little bit of finger pressing is fine at this stage here. So there's a cute little bodice. Oh, I love it. Now what we're going to do now is we're going to pin and sew the side seams. So with the side seams, so I've got my bodice facing front up, right side up, front up, and I'm going to get these two side edges, side seams, and with the main fabric, the bodice fabric, I'm going to line up that bottom raw edge there, and then the lining fabric I will line up that bottom raw edge there, matching these seam allowance in the middle. So to start with, I'm going to match up this seam allowance first. Now I'm going to press my seam allowance towards my lining. You can go either way, but I'm going to sew from this edge through to this edge. So it's easier if my seam allowance is going through to my lining than to have it going in the opposite direction of what I'm sewing. So here's that little intersecting seam under here. So I can pull that apart. At that 1/4 inch mark, I need to make sure that they're intersecting here. I'll get a pin. Place a pin in at that round about that 1/4 inch mark. See if it's lined up on the back. Here I can see it's not. So I'm just going to take that pin out and just place it into that seam. And that will help ensure that I've got those lined up fairly straight. Yep, pretty good. Place that pin, go to my bodice, my front bodice here, line up that bottom raw edge, and I'll place a pin. My lining fabric, I'll go to that bottom raw edge, get those nice and even, and I'll place a pin. And I'm going to sew from this direction here. Again, they're consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance as best as you can. Some locking stitches at the beginning and at the end. Now, manipulate my lining to this side, my fabric. I'm going to sew straight through until I intersect with this seam here, trying to maintain that 1/4 inch seam allowance. As I get to there, I'll remove my pin, and then I'll lift my presser foot with this lining fabric, manipulate that so that it now is sitting nice and flat in front of my presser foot. And I've got a fairly consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance again there. Bodice there, and I'll continue that side seam. And lock my stitches at the end. Got a loose thread there, I'll snip that off. And I'll snip these threads here. Okay, so that's that side seam done. And if we turn this over, flip our bodice over, we've got this side seam here. What I want to do is I want to pull this side seam so that it's open and flat. So I'll give that a little finger press. And especially at that intersecting seam there, give that a little bit of a manipulation and get that to sit nice and flat, and then finger press open that bodice as well. Now, if I flip this over at that intersecting seam from the right side, we can see here that that seam there sits really nice and flat, and that's purely because we opened up that seam allowance and we've got a nice flat seam underneath. And give that a little finger press, and that's our little armhole done on that side. What we need to do next, is I forgot to mention, is we're going to actually go to the pressing station and press these seams here open and flat. So from how I like to press this seam is from the lining side. Is if this is on my pressing station, I'll just bring my iron in, my tip of my iron, and I'll give this a gentle little press, and then I'll do some steam around this armhole, and then I'll just do a little bit of a finger press while it's still nice and hot. So I don't want to squash any of these little gathers here because they sit so pretty there. And then I've just done a gentle little finger press around the armholes just so that they sit nice there. So that's the back. And there's the front. The next step for us now is we're going to attach our waistband. So here's our waistband. And what I'm going to do is make sure I've got this lined up, edges even, and I'm going to just make a mark at the center front. So I'll do a little snip and another little snip at the bottom edge there. So right side of the fabric. And you can see I've got some tiny little snips in there, so I know where my centers are. So now, with our bodice, what we're going to do is the bodice front is get our waistband, lining up right sides of the fabric together, match that little center notch, and we'll place a pin. And we'll come around to the side seam, or the centre back seam, sorry. Line up those raw edges at the centre back and along this bottom edge, and we'll place a pin. Then we're going to go through here at the side seam here, line up that fabric. You can see you can sort of just pull that together like that. Bring that side seam up, match those raw edges, and we'll place a pin. You can go through there if you want and place a pin in between each of those locations there. You can place another pin in here. Line up those raw edges there. Now we're going to come over to the other centre back. So the edge of the waistband, line that up with the centre back seam of the bodice, the back of the bodice. Line up those bottom raw edges. Find it easier to come this way on this one. So lining up those edges there. Centre back, bottom raw edge, place a pin. Come through here, so now we've got our side seam here. We'll pull these together. We'll grab this little side seam, tongue tied again, and we'll place a pin. Try not to pin yourself. Place a pin in the middle here. Attaching your waistband like this ensures that everything is going to be eased in perfectly together. So you won't have any bunching at the waistband or anything like that. So there's our waistband pinned on. There it is from the bodice side here. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance right along that edge there. Lock your stitches at the beginning and end. Try to maintain a consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance as you're sewing this seam. And I'm just moving everything out from underneath so I don't accidentally sew anything I shouldn't be sewing. Now on this seam, I find if you can really try to maintain a consistent 1/4 inch from the raw edge here of this waistband, it will give you a nice, even, consistent waistband finish when we're at the end. So, okay, let's go. Try to maintain as best as you can a consistent 1/4 inch. Now here I can see my bodice fabric has moved and shifted a little underneath, so I'll just bring that back up. And there we go. Making sure nothing's caught in underneath here. Keeping everything nice and flat. Making sure still nothing tucked in underneath there. And we'll lock our stitches again at the end. Okay, so that's from our waistband edge. We've got a fairly consistent 1/4 inch. This is from our bodice edge. You can see here my seam allowance got a little pucker there and there. I should have checked. Normally I check as I'm going along to see that my seam allowances haven't folded over. It's on the inside. It's not going to be noticeable, so I'm just going to leave that there. So I'd just like you to see the little mistakes that I can make as well. It's not really a mistake. It's just something I could have watched for. Now, so from the right side of the bodice, I'm going to flip down our waistband. There we go. And now with the seam allowance on the inside here, what we're going to do is we want this seam allowance to come down into the waistband. So we can just come along here, if this is easier for you, can hold these apart and just give that a little finger press as we're going, just to help sort of manipulate that seam allowance towards that waistband. Depends how pedantic you want to be. I'm just sort of showing you little tips as we're going through. Some things you might like and some things you'll go, ah, no, that's not for me. But I just like to show you some different options. So if you really want to get a nice finish on your garments, these are the little things that you can do. Then from the right side, I'm just going to go through, manipulating that seam allowance towards the edge here, and I'm just giving that another little press with my fingernail. There we go. So that waistband is sitting beautifully now. Let's get rid of any of these loose threads. Now you can, if you like, another option is you can sew a row of top stitching around there, and that will hold down this seam allowance in there as well. I'm not going to do it in this video, so I can do it in another one like I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to give that a press now with the iron and pressing that seam allowance, giving it a nice firm press with some steam. Back again. So there we go. Bodice from the back. Now you can see there my seam allowance has been pressed nice and flat towards that waistband. It's not going to come back up again there now, but again you can top stitch that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to put our pretty little bodice to the side because we're going to work on our skirt next. Now we're going to go through on the center front of our fabric as normal. I like to make a little notch for my center front. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to finish off my raw edges along the sides and along the bottom. I've just finished my raw edges with a 3-thread overlock or serged finish there, just to prevent those edges from fraying. Now, what I've also gone and done is I've placed a pin at the halfway mark of this ruffle, the skirt ruffle for the dress, and I'm going to bring in the side seam from this side, and I'm going to place it over the top of that pin. I'm going to overlap it by roughly, approximately, doesn't have to be perfect, about a 1/2 inch. This will be where I will start my gathering stitches. It can be a little bit closer to the raw edge, it's sort of a personal preference. And I'm also going to mark where the halfway mark is on this side here. And what I'll do when it comes time to attaching the ruffle to the dress, this will help make it easier for me to sort of evenly spread out my gathers between the front and the back. It might need a little bit of manipulation, but it definitely helps. So bringing in that other side edge, I'm going to overlap that over that pin there in the middle, and I shall just place a pin there because that's where I'm going to start and stop my gathering stitches. On the pattern piece there is a little mark here indicating at the side there where to start and stop your gathering stitches, so you can mark that or you can just do it like this. So that's there, and I'll go through to this side, little crease there, and I will place a pin there. Now I'm going to do my gathering stitches here. If you don't like sewing over pins, the other option you can do where those pins are placed is just use a little fabric marker. This one's a vanishing pencil that I've got, and you can just make a little mark where those are if you don't like sewing over your pins. And I'm going to sew my first row of gathering stitches roughly about 1/8 of an inch away from that raw edge. And I'll just continue sewing right through. And I'll stop where that pin is there. Get to my needle, leave some nice long thread tails again there. And then I'll sew my second row of gathering stitches. This one here, a bit over, I'm probably going to be doing roughly about a bit over 1/4 of an inch for my second row of gathering stitches. And I'll stop the same place where I stopped the first row of gathering stitches. lift my needle, leave myself some nice long thread tails. I'm just going to push my pins all the way in now because I don't want them to fall out as I'm gathering. I can pop that in at the end. Now, what I need to do is I'm going to turn my fabric over to the wrong side because I'm really consistent as to which threads I use to pull up my gathers. So I always, it's just become a habit, I've done it for years, I always use my bobbin threads as my gathering threads. So I've separated those. I've got my bobbin threads and I'm going to start gathering this fabric, pulling that fabric through. There's my halfway mark, so that's my center, and I'm just going to do gathers from this side and pull them all the way through to the middle. As to how much to gather up, I always gather more than I need to because then I'll release some of the gathers a little bit later. I just find it's easier. So you can see there I've got quite a lot of gathers in there. I'll just give that a little press, so with those stitches there, they're nice and neat in there. And I'm just going to squeeze those and just give them a little tug. I find my gathers sit really pretty most of the time. So and then that's from the right side there. Now I'm going to go over to the other side where I've got my gathering threads, my bobbin threads, so they're on the bottom. So I might need to just make sure I get the right ones here. Okay, so I've got my bobbin threads. Grab those, and then I'm going to start gathering up that fabric there as well and pulling that towards the center. Just manipulating the fabric as I'm going along. I find if I hold these threads nice and taut, so I hold my gathering threads taut, and then I can just slide that fabric along those threads and it gathers up really well. Okay, so like I did on the other side, I'm just going to grab those little gathers and I'll give them a gentle little tug. You can see how much neater that they sit like that compared to this. Makes a big difference. Just gets them sitting down really nice and flat. So there we go. That's our little gathered skirt. I'm just going to bring back my bodice front. I've got my little notch at the center front here. So I'm just going to lay this down. Find where's my center notch. So there's my center. I've got a pin there. There's my little notch here. So with right sides together, the waistband and the skirt, I'm just going to line up that little notch there and I shall pin the waistband on. Now I'm going to come over to the sides, to the centre back seam of the skirt with the centre back seam of the waistband, and I am going to attach those with a pin, lining up the raw edges, or in this case one finished raw edge and one completely raw edge. Place a pin. And now I know I just need to evenly spread out the gathers between here and this section of the waistband. So I can just pull on and release some of those gathers and get these to fit into each other. So if I pull on my waistband, that sort of pulls the gathers of the skirt so that it fits in there neatly. So what I'm going to do now is those little bobbin threads come around this side here. I'm just going to place that pin there and where those gathering stitches started and that, and I'm going to wrap the gathering threads in a figure 8 around that pin. Just a few times is enough. And now I can go through and I can manipulate these gathers so that they sit nice and even through here. I have got a pin here at the center, so I can use that as a bit of a gauge as to where, if I look on the back here of this bodice, where the waistband is, that's roughly about there. So I can now just hold that there, or I can pin it, and I can just manipulate those gathers that way. Manipulate these gathers towards the center front here. And when I look at that now, I think, how's those gathers looking? I can bring more gathers towards the front if I want it a little bit fuller at the front. Let me see. They're pretty even. Just do a little bit more manipulation there. Need some more gathers here at my center front. I find your center front that's probably your most important part, because that's sort of like the focal part of the dress. So you can bring more gathers there. Line up those raw edges there. I can place a pin in here. There comes that long pin again. That was that bit there. Have a look here. Am I happy where they're sitting? I can take that pin out there now. Manipulate those gathers. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. And line up those raw edges and place a pin. That's pretty good. Now I'm going to go over to this side of the skirt. So I've got my centre back seam here. There's my centre back of the skirt and my centre back of the bodice there. There's the waistband. Line up that centre back seam. Line up those raw edges there. And I can pin that in place. Now, here we go again. There's my waistband. There's my gathers. So I can just hold on to where these pins are there, and I can pull that apart, and that will sort of make sure that these two edges are the same distance. Now I can just go through there and I can lock those threads in place. I might need to loosen it or tighten it again a little bit more, but I've got a pretty good starting place. Now I'm going to manipulate those gathers. Don't have to be too pedantic. I think so long as your centre front looks pretty good. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. I like how my centre front there is. I'm just going to take that pin out and I'll attach that to the waistband. Now, might need to release this a little bit. See how now my waistband, I've got that touch there, that was my centre front. I need to release these threads just a little bit more. Match up those edges there, just from that pin. Okay, that looks pretty good now. Reposition that pin in place, lock those threads, figure 8 around my pin, and then I can come back and line up those raw edges. That's pretty good. And pin that in place. So there we go. We're going to be sewing with around about a quarter inch seam allowance from side seam to side seam, which will end up, our stitching will be between those 2 rows of stitches. Now again, like we did on the top of our waistband, I'm actually going to sew from my waistband side, just so then I can sort of make sure that my quarter inch seam allowance is fairly accurate on the waistband side, because our waistband is quite a predominant feature on the dress. Back stitch at the beginning and the end. Because I've got that double row of gathering stitches underneath here, my gathers should still lay nice and flat. I can just double check as we're going along, and I'll bring up that raw edge of the gathers to line up with the raw edge of the waistband. My stitch length back to a normal stitch length as well. Let's go back there again. I still had it on my gathering. Making sure nothing gets caught in underneath. I'm just going to check those gathers underneath. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with those. I think they look pretty good. Nice centre back seam lining up straighter there. Take that pin out. I'm just releasing the threads that were on that figure 8 wrapped around that pin. And lock my threads again at the end. Now on this side here, it's that little figure 8 of threads that I had. Just release those. I'm going to grab that bobbin thread there, and I'm just going to release that, and I need to pull that out. I actually broke that thread, that's alright, to get a bit more of a thread tail to help me pull this row of gathering stitches out, because this row of gathering stitches is visible here on that right side of the fabric. So I'm just going to release that and pull that out. Helps if you don't cut your thread tails off too soon. And that's it, it's out. It doesn't take much to get it out. Now from the right side, what we're going to do here is that row of gathering stitches, that thread there, is I'm just going to pull that out as well. Now here you can see where my fabric had frayed at that gathering edge. I've got a few threads there that are poked through. To keep my work nice and neat, I'm just going to pull those out. Really happy with the little gathers there. So what we need to do now is we've got to press this seam allowance that we did here up towards the waistband. You can go through and do a little bit of a finger press, help you get started. Just going through there. So I can feel my seam allowance underneath is facing up towards the waistband. There we go. Now I'm going to go to my ironing board and I'm going to press this seam as well. Now what I'm going to do, because I want to try not to press these gathers too flat, is I'll go through with the tip of my iron, and what I'll do is I will run my tip, shoot little bits of steam, and then I'll do a little bit of a finger press along there. Back again from the pressing station. So you can see now I've given that a gentle little press, but I've managed not to flatten these little gathers. So I just held my iron and I just sort of pressed at a bit of an angle with some steam, and then just gave it a little bit of a finger press. So there's our cute little dress. It's starting to look adorable. Love it. I love this little bodice here. It's so pretty. For the centre back seam here, what we're going to do before we begin, the garment's right side out at the moment. Just going to open it up with this lining edge, which comes over and it will cover this seam here. So all this raw edge here of the waistband will all be tucked in underneath there. You can go to your pressing station if you want, and you can actually press up roughly around about 1/4 inch seam, or what you can do is just a little bit of a finger press, because we're not exactly sure how much of an overlap we need to cover this raw edge. I've made it so that the pattern, if you pressed up 1/4 inch seam allowance, you'll be fine. But if you want to be really particular, if you just bring these side seams down from under the neckline and see how far you need to fold up to cover that raw edge, keeping that nice and straight there. I can see there 1/4 inch seam allowance is fine, but I can just finger press that and hold that in place. Now the other place I want to check is my centre front. Now we know our centre front, we've got a little notch there, and we can actually see the little notch in the centre front here, so that we know that they need to line up. And if I just tucked under around about 1/4 inch, we want to check that this lays flat. So we don't want this pulling over like that. It needs to lay nice and flat. This will ensure your bodice sits really nice and flat at the front. So everything's sitting flat there. How much do I need to fold up? And yes, I think that little 1/4 inch seam is suffice. That works quite well. So I've got a little finger press there, and I did my side seam, and I can come over and I can double check this side seam as well. So lining up those side seam edges there. If I roughly fold over around about 1/4 of an inch, so folding that over, lining up roughly there, hold that down, and is that going to give me a nice finish through there and cover that seam allowance? And yes, it's going to cover that there nicely as well. And then we'll just work our way through to the edge, doing that 1/4 inch seam allowance as well, and we can give that a little press. So now you can confidently go to the pressing station using those little creases that you made by finger pressing and using that as a guide to press up that seam allowance, or you can just do a little finger press. Depends on how your fabric is, whether it'll hold a little crease or not. I find that helps, just a little finger press. Okay, I can see that there. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to sew our centre back seam. Now it's time for us to work on the centre back seam of our little dress, which is looking adorable. So from the centre back, okay, so here's our centre back and here's our yoke. What we need to do is we need to flip this centre back lining piece over so that the right sides are facing together. So it might be a little bit easier to go this way. So here's where we did our understitching here. So where that seam is, where that stitching line is, where we join the bodice to the lining, we're going to fold that over there. So our seam allowance is facing towards the lining. And we're going to line up that top edge. Might need to just pull that out a little bit there. Line up that top edge so that that edge of that seam is lining up at the top, and we're going to pin that in place. Okay. Right to there, and then coming down the centre back, we've got our lining here, and this is where I did that little finger pressing of that seam allowance. Just going to fold that back over, pull that down. So this seam allowance should sit sort of just below the bottom edge of that waistband. And I'll place a pin there, hold that in place. And if you need to, at this part here at the centre back, lay that out and we can place a pin there, lining up those raw edges as well. Now we're going to sew from the top edge here of the neck, and we're going to sew down to the bottom edge here of the lining, just hanging over that waistband that's in there. Put our neck edge there under the presser foot, 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'll sew a couple of stitches and then I'll lock those stitches in place. If you find, because you've got that bit of a seam there, if you find that you're getting stuck at all, yeah, just grab a little pin at the back and you can help pull that through. Get that seam started. Just making sure that nothing else is tucked in underneath here. Get that little bit of that skirt out of the road. Lining sitting just over that waistband, bottom of the edge of the waistband, and I'll just continue sewing that 1/4 inch seam allowance, keeping that folded edge of that lining tucked up. I'm just going to use a pin as a little extra finger to hold that down. Bottom edge of the lining, and I'll back stitch there. So here's that centre back seam, there's that neck edge, there's the stitching line, some understitching that I'd done previously earlier. Now what I'm going to do to turn this right side out and to make sure that I don't have any bulk in that top corner seam there, because that's going to be at our neckline, what I'm going to do is I'm going to place my finger in here, hold this seam down, got my thumb, or I should say place my thumb in here, hold this corner with my finger, and I'm just going to poke that seam through there. So now I've got this turned to the right side. Now if your corner hasn't come out nice at that neck edge, what you can do is if you just grab a little pin and you can pull that little seam out. Here we go. Now we've got a nice finish at our neck edge there. If for any reason you're finding that you're not getting a nice finish there, what you can do is with some form of a point turner, something with a point but not too sharp of a point because you don't want to poke a hole. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come in through here, I'm going to slide my little point turner on top of that seam allowance. So I'm actually sitting inside here on top of all those seams, and I'm just going to gently use the tip of that point turner and poke that corner there. And now we've got a fairly flat seam there. Here it is from the wrong side. So you can see there, everything's sitting in there nice and flat. That's how it should be sitting. Okay. Now I'm going to repeat that for the other side. Okay. So there's our little dress. So all we need to do next, we need to sew our lining that we've got here so that it encases that seam allowance. We've already finger pressed where we want to fold up that lining. So now there's a couple of ways you can do this, so it becomes a personal preference. You can place some pins where you want it to go, and you could do some hand sewing and just slip stitch that down in place, covering that seam allowance there. So that would encase all of those raw edges there and give you a nice clean finish. So that's one option. And I would just pin where those sort of side seams there sort of line up, and that centre front as well. But I'm going to show you another way that I like to do, and it eliminates any pins, I should say, and I'll be sewing this by machine. So I'm using a product here called Wash Away Wonder Tape. It disappears after washing. It doesn't add any bulk or anything to the dress. I'm going to place that in underneath there and just place it along the edge there where that seam allowance is. This tape's a 1/4 inch wide, and that seam allowance that we did there when we attached the skirt is about 1/4 inch as well. So I'm just giving that a finger press as I'm going along, moving that right over so it covers all of that seam allowance. Working my way up to the other end. Trim off that tape, and I'll just make sure that's sitting in there where I want, and that's sitting in there nicely now. Now I'll just give that another final little press so it's all in place. And what I'm going to do is, this can be a little bit tricky to get it started sometimes, it's just going to pull away some of that paper. Now I'm going to go back to, there's my side seam here of the bodice lining, and there's the side seam of my bodice. I'm going to press underneath, press under that little fold on the bodice lining, lining up roughly where that side seam there is, and just so that it sits over and covers that seam allowance. So it's sitting all nice and flat there. This has already started to fold over at our side seam here, because we did that 1/4 inch seam under there, so that's already started. Now I'm going to work my way to the centre front. So there's my centre front. Remove that tape. There's my notch at my centre front there on my bodice. My lining, I'll line those up, making sure this sits nice and flat, and make sure that covers that seam allowance there. and just press that down in place. Removing some more of that paper. There I can see my side seam again. There's my side seam. So line those up, making sure they're sitting nice and flat. And then I'll just finger press that down in place again. So far we're sitting really nice and neat. And we've got no pins there in our way at all. Remove the rest of that tape. And I've got my fold here already started from where we did that seam allowance. So tuck that over and bring that seam allowance over to cover. And that should be sitting nice and flat there for us. So we'll just double check before we sew that everything's sitting nicely there and everything at the front sitting nice and neat there as well. Got a nice little bit of fullness here from our gathers. So what we're going to do next is we're going to stitch from the right side. We're going to be stitching what we call in the ditch. So I'm going to be sewing close to this waistband, but I'll be sewing on top of my main fabric here, just as close as I can to the bottom edge there of the waistband in that seam. Now there's a couple of different ways you can do that. There's different feet that you can use. I'll just grab one here, like on my machine. This is like a little edge stitch foot, and it's got a little guide there, and that little guide can run along the edge of that waistband. And if I position my needle in this area here on the foot, I'm going to sew so that it's actually a little blind little stitch. I could do it as a top stitching feature, and that would ensure that I catched this lining underneath, but I've got that folded over enough over that edge there that I should be able to catch that pretty good. So I'm just going to change my presser foot. This one here on my machine, it's numbered a G, so I'll put this foot on. Rethread my needle there. Okay. Let's get that seam there sitting down nice and flat. Position my needle, position my fabric underneath. Okay, so my edge, that little blade is going to run right along through here. Now I can drop down my needle and see where it's positioned, and I can see it's not quite lined up, so I'll move my needle over, drop it down, and it should just go into there quite nicely, I think. Set at 2.4. You can make that stitch length a little bit longer if you like. Okay, now I might just do a couple of little locking stitches to hold that in place, and I'll just keep going along using that blade to run along the bottom edge there of my waistband. That's sitting nice and flat. Just helping feed that fabric through there. This little blade sometimes can get caught on some of those gathers there, so I just find it helps just to give it a little bit of a helping hand. Coming up to the end there, everything's sitting down nice and flat. And I'll do a couple of reverse stitches just to lock those in place. So now if we have a good look, we can't see, unless we really look hard, where those stitches are that we did. They're sitting just inside there. I don't even know if you can see them. Now we'll double check from the back side to see that we caught our fabric, and we've done a pretty good job. I've missed, just missed this little edge here. So what I can do, I'll show you a look there. You can see I hadn't pulled this down quite enough. Yep, so there's the stitching there. So I needed to actually bring that down a little bit further. So what I can do is I can go back over. I can just pull that down a little bit. I like to show you how I fix these little mistakes. It's so close to that edge. So if I just make a little pin mark here, you can see my pin through the back. I know where I need to just re-stitch over there a little bit. Just pushing that fabric down, and we'll have a go and we'll see if we fix that. Now back onto the right side of my fabric. I might just come this way again, going in the same direction I was sewing. I can remove that pin there. Just making sure, just want to make sure that that lining is sitting in underneath. Well, let's see how we go catching that. Remove that pin there. Know where I need to stop now. Let's have a go. So I've still invisible seam from the front, and looking from the back, yes, I've caught it. So I'm just going to remove those little thread tails there that I've got. Pull those up out of the road and snip those off. So that's ended up catching and encasing that in there. And that's just saved me from having to do some hand sewing. If I was doing this like to sell or something like that, I would have definitely have used a coordinating thread. It's caught the edge there. So if I had have done that with a purple thread, you wouldn't even see those stitches there, just sitting on the edge. All our little threads there. There it is from the right side. Totally invisible. And inside is really nice and neat and finished off. So I'll just remove some of those little threads. I like to remove, if I see threads, remove them as you're going. Just keep your work nice and neat. There we go. Snip those off. I'm pretty happy with that. So what we want to do now is we just need to close off our centre back seam. There's a couple of things you can do here. I'll demonstrate one way where we do actually have a closed centre back seam. So this part of the centre back here will actually have a closed seam. But another option that you can do is you can just sew straight down here, close that seam off, do a little seam along there, and that would finish off those edges at the centre back, and you wouldn't even have a closed in seam. Overlap those, and you attach your closure at the back there, and then you can do your hem. So, but what we're going to do today is we are going to turn our garment, our little dress, now it's actually a dress, turn that so the fabric's facing right side out. On your pattern piece for this skirt, you will actually find that there is a little notch here to indicate where to sew from the hem up to here. So what we can do, if we haven't marked it there, just line up those bottom edges, and I can see there, that's where I need to sew my little seam to. I can even just place a pin there Doesn't have to be absolutely spot on where you start and stop, but you just need a big enough opening. Now this seam here, you can do a 1/4 inch seam allowance there, or you can make it slightly bigger. Lining up those bottom raw edges. And I'll do some locking stitches. So we definitely need to make sure we do some locking stitches at the beginning and at the end of this seam, because this is where the little dress will be opening and closing to take the dress on and off. Locking that at the end. Now we've closed that little seam. Clip our threads. And we can press that seam open so that it lays nice and flat. You can go to the start pressing station and press that now, or you can wait until we've done the hem and we can just do all our pressing at the end there. Now to do the hem, you've got a couple of options as well. You can do a little double fold hem, so that would entail folding up roughly a 1/4 inch and then folding over again roughly another 1/4 inch, and that would give you a neat finish of a hemline, and then you can just sew all the way around. Then you could just do a little hem, even just a bit more than a 1/4 inch there, and just sew that all the way around. I've got a serged edged finish here on my hem, so that would be one easy option there that I could do, which I think I might just opt for that. I know the video's been quite long, but I want it to be quite thorough, showing you how to do the little dress. Okay, so I'm just going to finger press, and I can sort of gauge with my eye where I want that little hem to be. Just bring that down a little bit more, because what I can do is I could line up. There's my 1/4 inch gauge. There's the edge of my serging stitches there. And just do a little bit of a finger press and do my hem. Now I'll begin my stitches with a locking stitch at the beginning and the end. And I'll try to keep that fold as consistent as I can as I'm sewing my hem. You could pin the hem in place, but I just find that with such a small little seam, it's pretty easy to gauge. Sort of keeping the base of this hemline in line with this part of my presser foot. My needle is sort of roughly in line with the bottom edge here of my serger stitches, my overlocking stitches. A little bit of a finger press. And we're nearly at the centre back here again. Just going to snip off those threads where I started that seam. Where this little thread nest I've got here. Okay. Finger press that in place. And lock my threads. And now we've done our little hem. Turn my dress all the right side out. There's our little dress looking very, very cute now. There's our centre back closure. So this seam's closed here now. So all we need to do is decide on what closure option we're going to do. For this little dress, I'm going to do a Velcro closure for you. So I can decide which way I want my closure to go. Do I want the fold over this way, or do I want it on this way? I tend to like putting it on this side. So what we're going to do is we'll just get our Velcro. Got my Velcro here, so I've got a really thin, super thin Velcro that I like to use on my doll's clothes. So one side is, it's quite strong, but I find it really good. It doesn't pull on my doll's hair if it gets caught or anything like that in there. So I'll just separate these two pieces. My Velcro is about 4 inches long. Just check that. Yeah, it's 4 inches long, which is long enough to sort of go from the center back, and it'll come down just below this here, the waistband. Now, my personal preference is I like to do the soft side of my Velcro, which is really soft, on this side that's going to be closing over. Purely the main reason that I like to do that is I find that my stitches are much neater sewing over this soft Velcro than it is on the hook side, which is a bit rougher and coarser. So I like to put the hook on this side, and then the stitches that are sewn, they're more invisible on this side here, not as obvious. You will notice them on my dress because I'm using a blue thread. I want my soft Velcro, which has got my little soft little loops. I'm going to attach here. I like to use that little Wonder Tape again. I'll put it on the back of this Velcro, just down the center there. My Velcro, I've trimmed it to roughly about, what is it? It's about 3/8 of an inch wide. I'll show you a look. So that's my 1/4 inch, 3/8. So I've trimmed it to a 3/8. It was about a 1/2 inch wide, but I thought on this dress I didn't quite need the 1/2 inch. So again there now, I can remove that Wonder Tape and reveal that sticky side. My sticky side there is on my Velcro. Oh well, hook and loop tape is not officially Velcro. Start that near the top, close to the edge. Press that down, and I'm coming just over the edge there. Now I can stitch that in place. Now I've got this here. Now I'm going to sew just on the edge. What also I like to do is start just up a little bit. Position my needle back to the center there. Catch the edge. I'm just going to increase my stitch length just slightly. I've gone up to about a 2.6 there. Now I haven't locked my stitches there because I'm actually going to come around and I'm going to overlap those stitches. Coming up to the top. Turn. Now sometimes because we're going over that seam there, it's actually easier to have something to help guide that fabric through. Just going to place that there and just help feed that fabric through. Okay. Turn. So I've done 3 stitches across there, and I'm going to just help guide this through. Turn. And I'll come back up. And that's really nicely secured. Oh, slipped with my ball there. And I've come back over and I've double stitched over the ends here. So there's my stitching from the right side. Ended up with a little thread nest there again. Just tidy this up. And snip those threads. I should have used at the beginning of my seam there my little thread starter so that my threads didn't get nested there. That's pretty good. And what we can do too as another finishing option, when this is closed here, you can actually add some little buttons. So what's cute is a button here at the yoke, button at the waistband, and a little button in the centre. You can stitch those on by machine or you can hand sew those on. Now we just need to attach the other half of our Velcro. Got my Velcro here, and again I'm going to attach it to hold it in place using my double-sided wash away tape. Press that down. Move the paper backing. And I'm going to be this time attaching the Velcro to the outside of the bodice on this side. So, close to that neck edge, leaving probably around about 1/8 of an inch there, and pressing that down in place. Moving everything out of the way, and we'll go through and we can sew this one in place. Start here, so my threads, not starting on top of that waistband then, you can start anywhere you like. Now I shall just see that I'm lined up on the edge, encasing that Velcro, making sure I'm catching the Velcro. Turn. Here's my little point turner here, my point turner, my awl, just to help feed that fabric through. Turn. Make sure there's nothing getting caught in underneath there. Turn again there. I'll come back up and I'll finish where I started my stitches there. can snip my threads. From the back side, the lining side, from the bodice side. Okay, I can straighten out our dress again, close our back, line up the top edge, overlapping the velcro, the waist, and there we have it. There's our gorgeous little dress. So what we want to do now is just go to the pressing, a little press there. It's pretty good because I was finger pressing as I was going, but it's always nice just to give your dress that final little press and just remove any light loose threads that may be sitting anywhere there. But there you go. That's your gorgeous little dress. It's all finished and ready for your doll to wear.